Okay, last segment we were talking about the post-World War II Iran, and we talked about the Shah taking over from his father after the occupying Allied power left Iran, and the critical period that follows is 1951. This is a period in which Iran decides to nationalize its oil because they cannot reach an agreement with the British, who had a ridiculously one-sided contract with a weak Iranian government. So we have a very unlikely hero emerging from the nationalization. His name is Dr. Mosaddeq, and his main cause is to champion independence of Iran's resources from the hands of the British, who had controlled it. So with the and also this is a period that Shah has as yet not consolidated his power. There are elections, and Mossaddeq's Nationalist Front wins seats in the House, in the Parliament, and he ends up becoming a prime minister, and his number one agenda is to get the negotiation either going, or if the British refuse to give Iran what is the right formula, at least a 50-50 share in the oil revenues, then Iran will nationalize. As it happened, the British refused to do what the Americans were doing in Saudi Arabia, and they are very much against Mosaddeq. So Mosaddeq becomes incredibly popular during this period among the politically participant masses of Iran, and his government is very, very popular, and they decide to nationalize Iranian oil. And that brings the wrath of the British Empire upon them. The period is very formative and in many ways very sad for Iran. It is the golden age of the triumph of Iran's liberal democracy, but at the same time, that fragile government, in terms of its democratic credential, it is under a lot of pressure from the West, and the British decide that they want to bring it down. And what best way to do it than by placing an oil embargo so that Iran is unable to sell a drop of oil. In this situation, the role of the United States is almost critical, because at the end of World War II, there is no question that the preeminent world power is now the United States. The British are no longer in the same category as the United States was. Number two, you have the Cold War going on, very concerned about Iran being a very critical part of the Middle East with its oil resources, not to fall under the sway of communism. So American foreign policy during this period is very, very interesting and important. Initially, under the Truman administration, they were considered to be generally supportive of Iran's legitimate aspiration for gaining control of its oil resources. But the British decided that they were going to have to get rid of this government. There is a lot of debate in terms of American foreign policy whether there was a change in the foreign policy of the United States in 1951 under the Truman administration, and later in 1952 when the Eisenhower administration took over. As you look at the readings I've assigned for this, the coup is discussed in great deal of detail. In fact, when we talk about the coup, because that's what ultimately led to the downfall of Mosaddeq, you will see that I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing that, But what happened was, with the incoming Eisenhower administration, the British were able to secure American participation in the overthrow of the nationalist government of Iran. And so in 1953, a combination of CIA and MI6, the British intelligence, military intelligence, orchestrated a coup that ultimately overthrew the government of Mosaddeq. As I mentioned, I'm not going to get into the details of the coup at this point for a very simple reason. It's probably the most written about coup, especially after some recent declassification and leaks of documents regarding the coup. So the story is now pretty well known, although still some of the documents remain unclassified, not declassified, they're classified, I'm sorry. And not only that, some of the documents probably have been destroyed, but they don't shed a good light on the United States at all. And in many ways, the coup really set the tone for our foreign policy in the Middle East, at least in the early 1950s. So the United States has its first major, or undertakes its first major clandestine operation to bring about regime change in the case of Iran. And the success of that coup, if you can put the success in quotation mark, becomes a template for future covert operations by the United States. So a year later, Guatemala is next in line. In 1957, you get the same attempt at the same type of a coup pulled in Jordan, and again the same year also in Syria. So the 1953 coup has an importance that really extends well beyond Iran. It also offers an abject lesson of history for us, because it really talks about backlashes or the kind of untoward, unexpected consequences that's going to come back and haunt you. We did something in 1953 and Iranians were helpless to do anything about it. In 1979, there is a revolution, and the revolution is instantly considered anti-American by any standard, and it involves paying back to America. So this is what CIA calls blowbacks. These kind of decisions, they may look good at the time they're made, but the real cost of it may take several years before they become apparent. And there is a lot of things to be learned from these kinds of policies, and unfortunately, we don't always learn it. One thing that I do want to say about the coup was that it was one of the most poorly planned coups. In fact, it was so poorly planned that initially it failed. And the Americans were really desperate and totally despondent when it was first tried. It was thanks to two Iranians who had defected from the National Front, or they were close to National Front, who came and told the American operatives that, let's try it again, this time it would work. And the Iranians were correct in their estimate. So the coup 3 days later was reenacted, and this time it did work and brought down the only arguably democratically elected leader of Iran with it. So you got to think also how such a poorly planned coup became a template for other coups that we are going to undertake. So with the fall of Mosaddeq's regime, you have a period from 1953, the downfall of Mosaddeq, until 1955, when the Shah, who had succeeded his father, comes back to Iran after the coup. He had actually fled the country fearing that the coup was not going to succeed, but when it succeeded, he comes back, I should say, triumphantly, and he is forever tainted as being the American and the British agent, because the coup was one that ended up forever delegitimizing him. So he returns, and the first order of business for the new Shah is the suppression of the communists. Several of them are hunted down and they are executed. And the dissidents, mostly National Front dissidents, they're jailed. So the 2-year period after the coup is used by the Shah to consolidate his control of the government, and he begins to slowly succeed in so doing. By the end of 1955, the Shah has emerged as the dictator of Iran, and in so doing, he is further adding to his power. Now, it's instructive to see how Shah's control of Iran differed dramatically from that of Mosaddeq. So what I want to do is now go back to our control scheme and again show the difference before and after the 1953 coup. So looking at the compliance system that we discussed, during the Mosaddeq's last days in office, 1953, the primary means of control is what we have called normative active. That is the manipulation of symbols that attract the politically active masses. So the symbols here are secular nationalism, and I use that word secular quite advisedly. It's the secular nationalism that is the battle cry of Mosaddeq and others. And then, of course, independence. They want Iran to no longer be under the suzerainty and control of the British, especially the British stranglehold over the Iranian precious oil resources. So what gives control to Mosaddeq is these symbols that are mobilizing the masses in the main cities. Remember, the country is at about 5 to 10% politically participant. Outside of the cities, the traditional leaders control. But the cities are very important because that's where the government is. Secondarily, I put utilitarian. Notice I have a down arrow there. The down arrow here indicates the decline in material welfare of the country, and that is happening for a very simple reason. British have put a very tight oil boycott on Iran. Iran's main source of income is from the sale of oil. They cannot sell any oil, and so they cannot pay the government workers' salaries over time. And so what's happening is that the material welfare of the population ends up declining, and that's exactly what the British were hoping. By making life miserable, the Iranians will cry uncle. The next one is coercion. Coercion is relatively low because, after all, you're having a liberal regime. I would say that it's at this time there's a lot of press freedom. There are people attacking Mosaddeq, and he is allowing that to happen. In fact, the leftist newspapers are very, very harsh on Mosaddeq, calling him the American stooge, even though the Americans are preparing to overthrow him. So this would be the last item, would be the normative habitual. Normative habitual means acceptance of the dominant norms, and the dominant norms are being overturned a bit with this new government and the new crisis. So the situation is one of resembling crisis, and therefore normative habitual will be at the low level. Now, at the end of the coup, the control system changed dramatically. The first big change obviously was coercion. Notice that coercion shifts from the law under Mosaddeq to primary. Remember I mentioned that one of the first order of things for the Shah was to suppress the communists and dissidents. But this time it's happening because of British and American interference into the domestic affairs of Iran. Later on in 1957, these people are replaced by what Iranians see as their proxy, and that is SAVAK. SAVAK is an acronym for the secret police of Iran, who was very much feared and dreaded, and in many ways was very brutal agency. So I'll talk more about SAVAK later, but so SAVAK is the acronym for the secret police. At the secondary level, the U moves up because after the coup, the United States decides that it can now give aid to Iran, and Iran can sell its oil. So you have utilitarian referring to the material needs of the population improving, and so that's going to go up. At the same time, the traditional classes are rewarded because they're the one who sided with the British, and so they are also rewarded. Normative habitual moves up, and when you have coercion, I've said that repeatedly, at the primary level and normative habitual at the secondary level, that conjunction betokens an important point, and that is population's acquiescence. It's hopeless to expect change. When coercion is that high, you don't accept the system, but you have no choice to do otherwise. So that's why I call it a sense of resignation had set in. So in 1951 to 1953, Iran was full of verve. By 1950, at the end of the coup, by 1953, after the coup, and throughout that period, all of that verve, all of that excitement is gone and replaced by a sense of resignation that there's very little hope for Iranians to overcome domination by British, and now add to them the United States. Finally, normative active would be also at the lowest point, because if you recall, normative active refers to the manipulation of symbols that attract the masses by the government. If you have a government who is viewed widely as a puppet of the West, puppet of the United States, because of the coup, they are not going to be excited by that. That regime will lack any nationalistic symbol to be able to expect the masses to get excited and to mobilize the masses. Also remember that in this period that we're talking about, in the early to mid 50s, the political participation rate for Iran is hovering around 10%. No more than 10% of the population, again mostly the big cities, are politically participant. In other words, Iran still is in a pre-mass political state. Notice that I conclude this portion by pointing out that the coup totally delegitimized the Shah forever. And in some ways, the saga of the Shah from this point onward till the revolution can be seen as his attempt over and over again to try to restore a sense of nationalistic legitimacy to his rule, and unfortunately for him, always failing to do so. So he was marked forever as a result of that coup, and he is not going to be seen as a legitimate nationalist leader of Iran until he is actually overthrown.